So for decades, therapists, well-meaning friends, and just, society at large have all pretty much given grieving people the exact same advice.
Right, the classic, you need to let go speech.
Exactly. You need to let go,
Yeah.
move on. We kind of treat healing like looking at an x-ray of a broken
That's
arm.
a good way to put it, yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
See the clean break, the doctor sets the bone, and, eventually it knits back together. We basically expect this neat, visible, linear process where you just leave the pain in the past and step forward.
Which is, frankly, entirely unrealistic.
Yeah, and that's the thing. What if the actual science of human psychology just proved that advice is completely wrong?
I mean, it completely upends how we look at recovery. Because when you step into the world of human relationships, and specifically what happens to your brain and your body when a really profound relationship ends, that whole X-ray machine analogy, it's completely useless.
Right, because we are looking at a landscape of loss that is just entirely invisible.
Absolutely. And the honest truth is, there is no clean break when you have completely, entangled your life and your identity with someone else.
And wading into that messy reality is basically our mission for this deep dive today. We are exploring the actual mechanical psychology of loss.
Yeah, whether that loss comes through death or divorce.
Right. And our guide for this is a really fantastic article from Psychology Today by Dr. Susan Krauss-Whitburn. She breaks down this highly revealing new study by Simon Rubin and his colleagues at the University of Haifa.
It's such a fascinating piece of research.
It really is. And the core revelation here is just so validating for anyone out there who has ever lost someone. It shows that science is finally catching up to human nature, basically proving that holding on to the memory of someone is not a failure to move forward.
No, not at all. It's actually how we survive.
Exactly. So to understand why this research from the University of Haifa is such a massive paradigm shift, we kind of have to start by looking at the baseline it's actively dismantling.
Right? We have to look at how psychology used to tell us to handle loss.
The old view of grief.
Yeah, the old view.
Yeah.
Which essentially shaped all our cultural expectations of loss for generations. It's known as the detachment view of bereavement, and it actually originated with Freud.
Right. Okay. So the Freudian idea was that a healthy adaptation to losing someone basically meant you had to consciously, actively withdraw your emotional investment from that person.
You had to cut the cord.
Cut the cord, exactly. The prevailing wisdom was that to be psychologically healthy, like, say, a widowed person had to just accept reality by completely severing that emotional connection.
Which is incredibly harsh when you think about it.
It is, and the source points out how this effectively pathologized people who, naturally held on to their memories and feelings. If you were still deeply longing for a departed spouse years later, the psychiatric community basically looked at you and labeled you as fundamentally stuck.
Or mentally unwell.
Yeah. Okay, let's unpack this a little bit, because it feels like the Freudian view treats the brain almost like a hard drive. Or like managing a smartphone.
Oh, like deleting an app.
Yeah, exactly. You have to delete the old relationship app just to free up emotional storage space for a new one.
Right, and what's fascinating here is that modern psychology, specifically attachment theory, proves that the human brain does not function like a hard drive. You can't just drag someone to the trash bin and hit empty.
Because their brains actually map our partners onto our neural pathways.
Right, precisely. They don't just exist as these separate entities we interact with. They literally become part of our internal architecture.
So they're built into us.
Yes. Attachment theory argues that the very core of our self is built on the mental representations of the people we are closest to. I mean, you co-regulate with your partner. Your nervous systems sync up.
Oh, wow, right.
Their physical presence tells your brain that you are safe. So the bonds we form become structural to our actual identity. And because of that, you can't just excise a partner from your heart or mind without seriously damaging your own sense of self.
So if you lose them, your brain is essentially constantly firing signals to a receiver that, well, no longer exists.
Yes, exactly. And the researchers at Haifa propose that people absolutely do adjust to the reality of life without the deceased. Like you adapt to the physical absence.
Right, you learn to go to the grocery store alone.
Right. But they retain the emotional connection because those mental representations remain highly viable and accessible in the brain. I mean, having thoughts and feelings toward a living person is perfectly natural, so there is zero neurological or psychological reason for those feelings to suddenly just evaporate just because the person physically died.
That makes so much sense. And to see what this looks like outside of a clinical setting, the article brings up a really brilliant pop culture example that I think helps ground
Oh,
this.
from the show Shrinking, right?
Yeah, the Apple TV show Shrinking. So Jason Segel plays this therapist named Jimmy, and he is profoundly grieving his wife, Tia. She was killed suddenly by an alcohol-impaired driver.
It's a very raw depiction of grief.
It really is. And we watch Jimmy as he, slowly starts to piece his daily life back together. He eventually sets his fears aside. He even starts dating again. So he is demonstrably moving forward.
Right, he's functioning.
But he never thrusts aside his feelings for Tia. Like, he carries her memory directly into his new reality.
And Jimmy's journey there maps perfectly onto the framework the Haifa researchers use to understand the actual mechanics of loss. They call it the two-track model of bereavement.
The TTMB.
Right.
Yeah.
And this model essentially separates the grieving process into two distinct parallel tracks that are happening at the exact same time.
Okay, so looking at this model, track one makes total sense to me. It's the biological and social shock, right? The source calls it biopsychosocial changes.
Yeah, that's track one.
Basically, bereavement is a massive systemic stressor that affects how you function in the world. Like, can you go to work? Can you sleep? Are you eating?
And we really need to emphasize just how intense track one is. The physical toll of grief is staggering.
Because of the nervous system thing you mentioned earlier.
Exactly. Because your partner was part of your nervous system's regulatory structure, their sudden absence sends your body into chronic fight or flight.
Oh, so your body is literally panicking.
Yes. Your cortisol levels spike, your immune system is compromised, you experience severe cognitive fog because your brain is using, frankly, massive amounts of metabolic energy just trying to reconcile a reality that feels impossible.
Wow. So track one is measuring all of that. Just the sheer physiological and functional devastation of the loss.
Right. Which brings us to track two, which is where things get really fascinating.
And a bit more complicated, it seems. So track two focuses on the relationship itself, right? The ongoing emotional connection. And specifically something the researchers call the death story.
Yes, the narrative of exactly how the loss occurred.
Right. So in Jimmy's case, in the show, the story is that his wife was suddenly and violently killed by an impaired driver. The extreme unfairness of it becomes this major recurring feature of his internal life.
It replays for him constantly.
Yeah, but I have to push back on this a little bit, or at least play devil's advocate. Wait, isn't replaying a tragic loop over and over exactly what gets people stuck?
We are always told that, ruminating is terrible for our mental health.
This raises an important question, and it's a really vital distinction to make. It highlights exactly why track two is so clinically useful.
Okay, how so?
Well, rumination, where you just spin out in circles without generating any new insight or acceptance, that is detrimental. But according to the researchers, exploring the narrative of the death story is not wallowing.
It's not.
No. Clinically, it is a highly necessary psychological process called narrative integration.
Narrative integration.
Right, think about it. When a loss is sudden or violent, it completely ruptures your understanding of how the universe works.
Oh, I see. Right, the world is suddenly no longer a safe, predictable place. Exactly. So engaging with the death story is how the bereaved person begins to construct a scaffold for their grief. They aren't trying to change the past by replaying it. They are giving their brain a structured way to digest a completely unacceptable reality.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. The story helps them make sense of the sudden eruption of trauma.
Yes, allowing them to slowly integrate this horrific event into their ongoing identity rather than just being totally destroyed by the shock of it.
So they are basically building a narrative bridge from the world where their partner existed to the world where they don't.
Exactly. That's a great way to visualize it.
But okay, here's where it gets really interesting. If the brain relies on these mental representations to maintain our identity, and we use narrative to process the ending, what happens when the person we lost is actually still walking around out there in the world?
Ah, yes. Divorce.
Right, because the Psychology Today article explicitly extends this entire two-track framework to another kind of profound bereavement: divorce.
It is a brilliant application of the model because divorce is absolutely a profound grief, but the mechanics of the ending and the mechanics of the continuing bond are fundamentally different than a death.
Yeah, let's look at how those two endings actually diverge. The source points out that divorce is almost always a very gradual process.
It doesn't happen overnight.
No. The dyad slowly unravels over time. You evolve from courtship to companionship to, well, dissolution.
Right.
I like to think about it like maintaining a car. Divorce is often like a slow leak in a tire. You hear the hiss, the handling gets a bit wobbly, you try to patch it to keep things going.
But eventually the tire goes flat and you just have to pull over and change it.
Exactly, you saw it coming. The death of a spouse, however, is like a sudden, catastrophic blowout at 60 miles an hour.
Yes.
You had absolutely no warning, and instantly the entire structure of the vehicle is compromised.
That is the perfect analogy to understand the systemic shock of death versus the gradual decay of divorce. But, the most significant divergence actually happens in the aftermath.
When we look at it through the lens of mental representations.
Exactly. Because in a divorce, the partner is still physically out there in the world.
Right. And especially if you share kids or have intertwined finances, you still have an ongoing relationship. You still have to interact with them.
Which creates massive psychological friction. Because they are still alive, your internal image of them, your mental representation, is constantly being updated.
Oh, wow. And usually not with good things, right?
Exactly. It is often being updated with highly negative data. You are arguing over custody, you're dividing assets, maybe you are seeing them out at a restaurant with a new partner.
So your brain is forced to constantly update the mental representation of someone you used to love with new evidence of why they are currently causing you pain.
Right.
That's a massive cognitive dissonance.
It's incredibly disorienting. The continuing bond in divorce is this really messy, complicated mix of internal memories of love and external ongoing realities of conflict.
But in death, that mental representation is totally frozen in time.
Yes. The ongoing real-world interactions simply cease.
The article says this activates a matrix of memories, emotions, and representations that hits the grieving person.
Yes, and it hits with such turbulent, concentrated force precisely because it is frozen. The representation you hold of a deceased partner is pure. It becomes this really potent, distilled mix of intense longing for the closeness they provided, crashing headfirst into the stark, absolute reality that they are alone.
Because there's no new data coming in.
Right. There's no new, mundane data like a fight over the electric bill to dilute the memory. So the continuing bond in death is entirely internal and crystallized, which is why that longing is incredibly sharp.
It really illuminates why a one-size-fits-all, just move-on approach is so completely inadequate for human beings. I mean, we are dealing with fundamentally different types of architectural collapse in our brains here. So what does this all mean? I want to bring this theory directly down to earth for you listening, because this isn't just about clinical models of spouses. The article highlights that this continuing bonds perspective applies to the death of a parent, a sibling, or, any close relative.
Right, it's a universal mechanism.
And it specifically addresses the physical stuff we leave behind, the tangible things we keep.
And the practical application of this research here is profoundly comforting. Because if we connect this to the bigger picture, under the old Freudian view, the physical objects were seen as a huge problem.
Right. And if you're listening to this, you've probably felt that guilt, like the guilt of keeping a box of your ex's things in the back of the closet.
Or refusing to get rid of your late grandfather's old watch, or a deceased ex's favorite book.
Exactly. Wondering if there is something wrong with you for not throwing it away. Because the old view would have labeled that as a failure to detach, right?
Yeah.
Holding on to the past in an unhealthy way.
It would have told you that you were actively preventing your own healing. But attachment theory completely reverses that. The source explicitly notes that holding on to their meaningful possessions is completely fine.
It's actually therapeutic.
Yes, actively therapeutic.
Because those physical objects serve as tangible anchors for the mental representations we've been talking about. They aren't preventing you from moving forward. They are literally physical manifestations of the internal architecture that person helped build inside of you.
Precisely. We use them as transitional objects to ground us. By recognizing that emotional ties naturally remain when bonds are broken, we can fundamentally reframe our relationship with loss.
We can stop feeling guilty about our lingering grief.
Right. We don't have to fight the memory or source ourselves to quote-unquote let go. We can actually derive deep comfort from those mental representations, holding them close, while simultaneously taking our next steps into the future.
You integrate them into your new reality.
Exactly. You carry them with you, rather than leaving them behind.
That is just such a powerful shift in perspective. So to quickly sum up what we've covered in this deep dive, forget Freud's advice to just detach. Sever the cord.
Throw it out.
Yeah, throw it out. Science, attachment theory, and the two-track model of bereavement prove that we are allowed to carry the people we've lost with us. Whether a relationship ends through death or the slow unraveling of a divorce, the emotional bonds remain because they are an essential physiological part of our internal architecture.
And that brings us to a final thought to ponder as we wrap up today's discussion.
Oh yeah, let's hear it.
If the very core of our self is built on the mental representations of the people we've loved and lost, as attachment theory suggests, then how much of your own personality is actually yours?
Oh, wow.
And how much is just a beautiful, living mosaic of everyone you've ever cared about?
I absolutely love that. Think back to that x-ray of the broken bone we talked about at the very beginning. When a bone heals, the structure is forever changed by the break.
Mm.
It might be thicker in some places, entirely different in others, but the history of that fracture and the history of what it survived is permanently written into the skeleton.
It becomes part of the foundation.
Exactly. We hope this deep dive helps you think about whose pieces you are currently carrying in your own mosaic and why holding on to them is exactly what makes you, you. Thanks so much for joining us.